Book inside.
Mango. Dan, that's the Heineken.
No one else is leaving me
No one's brave enough to take this Somebody brave enough. Somebody brave enough to take this on.
So curious, aren't you?
Oh yeah, we did actually. Yeah, I got it yesterday.
I guess I hadn't seen one.
I'm pretty well.
So I think we've reached a critical mass. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. To start things off, I want to invite Dean Simons to welcome Sam.
Sure, thank you, Nick. So where are we? In the title poem of his latest book, Professor Joseph asks that question twice. And as you'll see, I think he's going to read this poem later. You know, maybe we are in the path of a fiery avalanche that is going to devastate us. Maybe we are under a intense, cloudless blue sky. But I actually began with that question because I meant it literally. Where are we? We're in the writing set. This is actually the first time we've done an event like this in the writing set. But it's particularly appropriate to do it here because it illustrates for you the connection between poetry and writing, between your law study and what you have to do as writers. Without this event in mind, I think I said in class just this week that reading a statute as opposed to reading a case is like reading a poem. And you have to read it like you read poetry. Every word, every line, every piece of punctuation has meaning. I was an English major. Not necessarily because I love poetry, sorry, Larry. 19th century novels were actually my thing, but what the training I had reading poetry was tremendous preparation for law school and for being a lawyer in ways that I had no idea. And what I want to encourage you to do today, as you listen to the conversation between Nick and Professor Joseph, and then listen to Professor Joseph read his poems, is appreciate the art for what it is, but also listen to the poems with the ears of a lawyer, and listen to the words with a lawyer's sense of meaning. And I want to read to you just a very brief excerpt from a law review article that was written a few years ago, before this book came out, entitled Law and Poetry, by a professor at an American law school, a professor at a German law school. I've read a lot written about Professor Joseph's poetry. I had not seen this article until I came across it earlier today. And I want to highlight two things for you. This article, which is about law and poetry, talks about lawyer poets. So yet, while law and poetry are different, there's something intriguing about the relationship between them. Many lawyers are poets, including such two-world figures as Wallace Stevens, Edgar Lee Masters, William Cullen Bryant, E.E. Cummings, Archibald MacLeish, and Lawrence Joseph, to name a few American poet lawyers. Not bad company, if you know anything about poetry. But what I really wanted to read to you was an excerpt from this article that comes from the section that's actually talking about Professor Joseph's poetry. And the conclusion they draw is, the stuff of law is words. Words and words, sentences and sentences, communicating through language the meanings of events and facts, issues and questions, rules and counter-rules, or standards of conduct directed by law. Law is one big struggle over what the meaning of an event or a case or a force is. There's a strain to get it right, or to get it the way you want, as the different actors push and pull to convey their points, in a sense like artists trying to form the canvas according to their desires. We might call this the struggle of law, which Joseph captures very well. And it's wonderful that we have the opportunity here within St. John's, to have a resident poet, to have one so accomplished, to have one whose work relates directly to law, a lot of other things, but in its essence to law, and whose work is an example of the power of words and the power of communicating meaning through words. That's a really important lesson for all of us. I'm going to turn things over to our host for today and our moderator, Nick DeMarco, who is, among other things, the outgoing, no longer editor-in-chief, the editor-in-chief, the former editor-in-chief of the Law Review, and himself quite an accomplished appreciator of poetry and art. And Nick is going to kick things off by interviewing Professor Joseph. So welcome, everyone. Thank you, Nick. Larry, we're looking forward to this.
Thank you, Dean Simons, for your kind words, and thank you for getting us started thinking about tonight's event. And thank you for facilitating this event. I also want to briefly thank Dean Brady for her help implementing tonight's event, as well as the other members of the law school administration who provided assistance along the way. Tonight's event is a testament to the support this school gives to its students, as well as the vibrancy of academic discourse taking place in the building. And I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. So like Dean Simon said, my name is Nick DeMarco. I'm a third year here. I'm a loyal teaching assistant to Professor Joseph in his towards class, and I'll be escorting us through tonight's event. With that job in mind, let me forecast what's on the docket for this evening. So after some quick remarks, we'll start off with a discussion between myself and Professor Joseph, in which I plan to take a back seat. After our colloquy, Professor Joseph will read to us a few of his poems, some from his most recent collection, which we have here, So Where Are We?, which Dean Simons referenced, and others from earlier collections. We'll then invite some questions from the audience before closing out the evening with refreshments and some food in the back. Many of us know Professor Joseph, the first year towards professor. So tonight we do not so much leave Professor Joseph, the first year towards professor, behind as we attempt to add layers to that conception. Professor Joseph, the boy from Detroit, grandson to Lebanese and Syrian migrants. Joseph the lawyer, Joseph the essayist, the critic, and of course, Professor Joseph the poet. By exploring these identities and the way they operate in his work, is our hope and my hope that we might glimpse, however briefly, at the powerful mind that, with remarkable intensity, sets forth the realities of our day in his poetry, in his prose, and of course in his towards class. So a little bit about you. Lawrence Joseph was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1948. As I said, grandson to Lebanese and Syrian Catholics who were among the first Arab immigrants to Detroit. He received a Jesuit education at the University of Detroit Jesuit High School before heading to the University of Michigan and later Magdalene College of Cambridge, where he studied English literature. Professor Joseph also secured a JD from the University of Michigan Law School in 1975. Thereafter, he clerked for Justice Jean Menon Williams of the Michigan Supreme Court. And after a stint on the faculty at the University of Detroit School of Law, he relocated to New York City in 1981. He began as an associate with Sherman and Sterling. He worked there for several years. And since 1987, this school, St. John's, has been lucky to have him as a professor, where he's taught torts, employment law, jurisprudence, and law and interpretation. I also want to mention that Professor Joseph is married to the painter Nancy Van Gogh. Is that right? So throughout his time at St. John's and before Professor Joseph has prolifically written poetry, prose, essays, and criticism. He's authored 6 books of poetry, including Codes, Precepts, Biases, and Taboos, a 1983 collection of his first 3 books, books of poems, Before Our Eyes, Curriculum Vitae, and Shouting at No One. His next book of poetry was published in 2001. It's called Into It. He followed that up with his most recent collection, So Where Are We?, which was released this past August and was published by Forrest Strauss. I also want to mention that Professor Joseph has published Lawyerland, which is, we'll call it a piece of creative nonfiction, or less, and The Game Changed, Essays and Other Prose, which is a personal favorite of mine. Quick about your work. David Steele has called you the most important lawyer poet of our era. John Ashbery said, "Yours is poetry of great dignity, grace, and unrelenting persuasiveness, and that you give us new hope for the resourcefulness of humanity and of poetry." David Orr at the Times ranked your new collection, So Where Are We, as one of the 10 best books of poetry in 2017. And it also, your book, So Where Are We, also made Anthony Domenico's top books of 2017 in Commonwealth. It's been reviewed favorably in Bomb Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, Mother Jones, among other publications. Lastly, a personal note. So I first encountered Professor Joseph in the fall of 2014 when I stumbled upon his poem On Nature in a magazine. This was the first time I also encountered St. John's Law. And upon reading the poem, I knew I had to apply here, and I knew I had to speak with this man. The rest is history, and I'm delighted to be with you here tonight, Professor, and we are really lucky to have you here with us tonight. So please join us in welcoming Professor Joseph.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Dean Brady. Thank you all for coming.
So I thought it'd be good to get us started. I'm interested to hear a bit more about growing up in Detroit in the 1960s. You've said your Jesuit education formed you in fundamental ways, and that Detroit's Catholic world is something that never leaves you. Maybe you could talk about that and how your upbringing sort of put you on the path to poetry.
Yeah, my grandparents were emigrated from Lebanon and Syria early 20th century, around 1910 or so. And then they ended up in Detroit, ultimately, when Detroit began its the mass production of the automobile by Henry Ford, and Detroit grew exponentially from, I think, the 10th largest city in the country in 1910 to the 4th largest city by 1930. And so Detroit was historically maybe the greatest boom town in the history of the United States. The whole side of the history. They were Catholic. They were Eastern Rite Catholics, which is a part of the Roman Catholic Church, and Arab. They're Arab Catholics, and there was a great deal of the numbers of persons who immigrated were small, but they immigrated, the largest number of them from the then Arab world immigrated to Detroit. And my grandparents were among the first, and they started stores, grocery stores. My parents were born here in Detroit, and they went to Roman Catholic schools, parochial schools. And then and grade school and high school, as did their brothers and sisters. And then they didn't go to college. My dad, with his brother, entered into the grocery business after the war. And my generation, we've all gone to college, and the nieces and nephews and everybody's going to college. But the really central, one of the central, if not the central, I think it's the central part of our lives was really fundamentally part of Catholicism, and also Detroit, this remarkable city in American history for all sorts of reasons. And I was born after World War II, but my parents were born right after World War I. And so sort of the history of my family in Detroit really is the history of Detroit from the beginnings of its growth and then its history. Basically, it's 20th century into the 21st century history. The Catholicism was crucial. Detroit had a very strong Catholic community and Catholic grade schools and high schools. I think in size, Detroit was close to what Queens would have been. And I think the number of Catholics in Detroit was probably similar to what Queens was in the 1950s. in terms of the grade schools and high schools. And so there was all that world. I went to the Jesuit High School in Detroit. There's one Jesuit High School in Detroit. There's actually two now, but one of them is not. It's a Cristo Rey school, and it's not college preparatory. The Jesuit schools in this here are Xavier, Regis, and Fordham Prep, and then St. Peter's and Newark, I think, are all Jesuit schools. Brooklyn Prep existed at one point, so they were basically a Jesuit school in every borough. And that was a really, and my brother and cousins we went to this high school in Detroit, and that had a huge effect on me, being educated by the Jesuits. I was at the Jesuit high school from the early 60s to the mid-60s. My freshman year in high school was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Vatican II happened while I was in high school. And then Detroit was changing and America was changing. And significantly in that part of the 1960s. And then after that I went to the University of Michigan for the latter part of the 60s. So,
Is that where you started to write poetry, or did you write poetry?
yeah,
before?
I hadn't written poetry before. And I started writing poetry when I was in Michigan. I took a class, an introduction to poetry class, and I then got, it really was, I've been reading these poems that I was reading at the time, during this class. I realized at some point that, I mean, just the, I don't know why this was. I felt at one point I wanted to do that. That's what I wanted to do, and I've been doing it since. And so I wrote my first poems when I was a freshman at Michigan. But I've always believed that and I've said this repeatedly, I've written this, that poets who do this as long as I've done it, you do it because you have to do it. In other words, it's a need, it's a compulsion. And all the poets say that. In other words, and it really has nothing to do with class background or any of that. Poets come from, an artist really come from, they're compelled to do it. They're compelled to make art. And this was the kind of art I was compelled to do. I realized James Joyce, who was Jesuit educated, the great Irish author, wrote a book called The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And in that, he talks about his Jesuit education. And, but the basic, one of the parts of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is that he was always an artist from the time he was a child. It starts with listening to sound. And poets listen to sound because there's musical and rhythm and poetry. Sound is extremely important to poets. And so he was sound obsessed. And then he realized at some point he started doing this. So I think that's similar to what happened to me. So I've always been doing this. But then I began to really do it. I mean, I studied it. Very careful. I studied it at Michigan, and I won a major writing award at Michigan, and then I won a fellowship to Cambridge to study literature, which I did for 2 years. And then I returned after that. I went to law school at Michigan.
I want to ask you about the law school. Could I ask you about the process of doing it, of making poetry? Professor Skeel says that the aesthetic of your poems is the reworking of what is seen and heard into something both familiar and radically new. So what is the process there?
Well, it's an endless process. I mean, it's a constant, endless process. I'm constantly learning and I'm constantly putting myself up against other poets, and not my contemporaries. That's not the competition. The competition or the ambitions against the art and making the art. And there's a side to this that has nothing really to do with myself as such, but as myself that needs to do this, wanting to do it as well as I can and make them as well as I can. so that's part of the ongoing study. And I consider it study, Wallace Stevens was a lawyer, he was a surety bond lawyer and a great poet. He said at one point that poetry is a scholar's art. And it is, in the truest sense of the word. Poets study the art, they study everything. They study, and being a lawyer and then being a legal scholar, a law professor is comported very well with that because I'm constantly, laws, I've told many of you in the room, is you never stop learning it. You learn it your entire life. It's never, nobody ever knows it all. And it's that knowing, and so that's brought in a whole side of language and experience and everything that's relatively unique among lawyers, or I mean among poets, especially American poets. It's a small group of poets who have done it. So the making of it, I've written about it constantly in interviews, and the making of the poem, it's very important. And also becomes part of what I write in the poems. In other words, the making of the poem becomes part of the subject of the poems.
The poet is in the poem, or the
Yeah,
identity?
and the poet identity is in the poem from the beginning. You know, that's part, and that's not, I'm not the first one to do that. And then the poet identity also has other identities, and there my background comes into play, and the lawyer identity is a significant identity. I put it in the poems. I put it in the poems from the beginning, which Stevens didn't do, but William Carlos Williams, who was a doctor and a great poet, and a peer to Wallace Stevens did. He was a doctor, could have been the word. And I decided to do that, and that creates a whole kind of aesthetic, critical reality.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, and how you would inject the lawyer identity into some of your poems. Of course, there's Lawyerland, but I also think of Purette and Vitae, where there's sort of portraits of big law poets.
Yeah. I've just written a piece that's going to be published in the Cambridge University Press on a book on narrative metaphor and law. And I was asked to by the editors to do something that none of the other people were asked, which were sort of leading law and literature people from all over the world. I was asked because I have my poetry and my prose, Lawyerland, to write about narrative metaphor in the creative process. In other words, I make the stuff that is part of what law and literature is studying literary texts. So I try to make literary texts. And then I talk about that one of my identities as a lawyer and how I put it in and where I put it in. But it comes from the beginning of the first book. And I continued it, so it becomes a kind of ongoing subject, alongside the ongoing subject of the poet inside the poems. And then my other identities. I'm very well aware of my, from my experiences in Detroit, my family's experiences in Detroit and New York. And so that I've always been concerned with identity because of the kind of sense that my imagination and my life, to a great extent, has multiple identities, which we all have. It just depends on what environment we're in. But it's something I've explored.
You mentioned Wallace Stevens. He once said that he was a great poet laureate of the 20th century. He once said that he did not have a separate mind for the law and a separate mind for the poetry. Instead, he did both with the same mind. Is that sort of comport with your understanding?
No, I mean, when I'm teaching torts, I'm not thinking about writing poems. I'm teaching torts. You wouldn't want me to be thinking about, I can turn off the process, depending on what you're focused on. But it's the question of moving into different types of concentrated areas of language and what the purpose of it is. So if you're practicing law, you're using language. Law is a language system. There's no law without language. And that's where it's similar, I think the most similar to literature. Because literature is language, and a law deals with all sorts of critical choices in how you use language. As does literary writing. The big difference is, and it's the essential difference, is the law is a political system. And so it's this remarkable language system that's rooted in the politics and power. And in the criminal system, it's the crime and punishment, incarceration by the state, it's the state, and it's power. And of course, it has policy, political dimensions to the civil law, the same thing, but in distributions of money. Because that's ultimately what the civil system is about. And as Dean mentioned, the statute, lawyers pay attention to language. They have to pay attention to language. Statutes, for example. I think I say when we go through statutes and teach towards at least, I think I always say this, that it's not a fun activity. I don't enjoy reading statutes. You have to go through them, and I read them out loud, not only in my class, but I read them out loud myself. So you can just try to get some sense of what they sound like, which they're not in conversational language, but they're language, and you have to interpret this. And then you're in the legal system and all the interpretive questions of that. It's probably a lot like people don't like reading poetry because poetry is difficult and you have to pay attention to every word. Poetry has different payoffs because poetry is dealing with emotion and feeling and all sorts of other things. Law is dealing with a particular type of question. So when I'm doing that, I'm focusing on that. And so I've been doing both for a very long time, and so it's all part of the same imagination. And they feed off of one another, but they also compete. And when I'm in the one, I'm not in the other. But they overlap. So it's really one line. Stevens also has an example where he came to a reading after he had been at work. He was an in-house counsel for Hartford Insurance, and this reading was at Yale, and he comes in and he's got his briefcase. And he takes out 2 files. And one file is this is my work, my law work, in this file, and this file is my poetry. So they're all looking out. It's got 2 files, all these things. Well, where's files? I got files, you all have files. Notes. Another lawyers take notes. I'm a note taker. There's writers that take notes. The outlining process is a note-taking process, essentially. Lawyers are constantly you're thinking about language, composing language at some point. They're all either presenting it or whatever. It's always language, but it's focused on something else.
You said you felt compelled to produce poetry. Did you feel something driving you to the legal profession? Or what brought you to be a lawyer? Was it a similar compulsion?
That's a good question. I was raised to be a lawyer. The only professional in my parents' family was my mother's brother, who was a lawyer, and quite a prominent workers' compensation lawyer in Detroit. He was a wonderful man. And my older brother's a lawyer, quite a prominent antitrust lawyer. And so we were raised, I didn't have any aptitude for science or math. I found that out in high school. But I like language, and also, and I think this is imaginative. I think for some reason or another, I like the way the world operates. Not all poets care, and a lot of them do. And I'm among those who do. And I've always been intrigued by the social world, strong social imagination. And I think people with strong social imaginations often end up being lawyers. That's not every person who's a lawyer doesn't necessarily have a strong drive to social imagination. but there are lawyers who do have strong drives towards social imagination on your social issues, which are all the social issues of law. And I've always, I go back now, which I can think about this, and that's been there from the beginning. So both things are operating at the same time. So when I'm forming thought, even when I don't even know I'm going to form this in poems one day, I'm forming thought about the social world. Poems have an interior world too. The law doesn't have much interior world. In fact, it doesn't really have any. The law is an exteriorized language, very important exteriorized language. We all bring our interior lives to it, but we then are in context. Lawyers are always in context. You're always in a social context as a lawyer. And when you're involved in it, and even when you're thinking about it, which, at a certain point, we're lawyers, so we think about it more or less, and it becomes part of the way that we think. So when I finished at Cambridge, right, most of my peers were even going into getting PhDs in English, which I could have done. And then we had the beginning of writing programs. And now there were like 4 at the time, and now there's like 400. And I decided quite consciously to do what Stevens had done. I was going to do both. And so that's what I did.
How did your parents react? You wanted to be a poet.
They didn't negatively react. They were worried that I'd be able to make a living. I worry about it too. I didn't come from money. I come from a lower middle class, working class, essentially, background. And so I worried about it too. I worried about the fact that I could make a living as a lawyer one way or the other. And teaching, getting a PhD would be costly, and it's always a very tight market and everything. So that drove the decision quite a bit.
You said something a couple minutes ago that interested me. The idea of the lawyer bringing his or her interior life to the legal issue. Maybe that's a way to get into talking about your contribution to the law and literature, sort of what your scholarship in that area has been like.
Well, what happened was that when I started, I clerked and then I taught. And after I clerked in Detroit at a Jesuit university, the University of Detroit law school was a Jesuit law school. And I stayed in Detroit, which few of my classmates in Michigan did. This was Detroit in the 1970s, which after the oil shocks, Detroit went into what I call a long depression. It's still in this long depression. It's been in a long economic depression for 40 plus years. The justice I clerked for the Michigan Supreme Court in the office in Detroit, he had been the governor of Michigan for 12 years. He was a Democrat, very prominent Democrat, one time presidential, not an aspirant, but considered as a presidential candidate, and very much rooted in Detroit's history, labor history with the United Automobile Workers. And he was a very prominent Democrat. He was the leading of the governors in the country, really the leading civil rights governor in the country. And he's from Detroit, which has its history of class and race, which are among the most significant histories in the country and our history. What happened when I got into academia, when I started teaching, when I clerked, I had done, I was in Detroit, and I taught torts, and I taught workers' compensation, which I used to get 50 students in a workers' compensation class in Detroit because it was tied into the auto workers and the whole political side of that. But at the same time it was happening, and this was happening when I was in law school in Michigan. Michigan was the first place where law and literature really developed as a discipline. That was because of a number of my professors were involved in it. And then in the early 1980s, James Boyd White, who was sort of considered the founder of it, went from Colorado to Michigan. And I knew everybody. And they knew I was a poet. They knew I was a poet in law school. They were very supportive. The dean, who was a dear friend of mine at the time, was very supportive. I had really wonderful teachers. And I had a teacher, Joe Sachs, who virtually invented environmental law. And Gail Kamazar for constitutional law and criminal procedure. He invented criminal procedure. And this was, Ann Arbor's 40 miles from Detroit. It's very close to Detroit. So this was a very time. And suddenly, and they were very supportive of the poetry. And they knew I was a poet. Williams knew I was a poet. They knew I had won this major award in Michigan, which is a very prestigious award. And they've been supportive from the beginning and to this day. And, the University of Michigan has been enormously supportive of my work and on both my poet side and my lawyer's side. But I became interested, I was part of this. I mean, they recognized this. And so as this, in the 80s, it just kind of boomed, this whole law and language and literature and interpretation, and I became part of that. My earlier scholarship was not heavily on compensation and tort. I was on a commission for the governor of Michigan on tort reform, and I wrote on that. And then labor. I did a lot of writing on labor. Labor really is an employment which I taught, very important to me in all sorts of ways. And it gets into my writing. And a lot of that comes from my own background, from being from Detroit, from that kind of Detroit that I came from. So I became actively involved in the law and literature sort of rubric from the point of somebody creating, publishing a literature, being recognized in the literary world. There was nobody else doing this. And this, this was recognized by those in this world. And so, and I've been written on quite a bit in legal literature on various kinds of things. And I've written on it a lot, on interpretive questions and things. So that's part of how much of this was a result of being tied to Michigan. It's entirely, that's where it came from. And so I was kind of an insider. And unique in the way that, because you end up studying text and literary texts in law and literature, that I was creating recognized literary text. That was being from my first book, which won a prize. And this is my literary side within their, people know that I'm a lawyer, lawyers know that I'm a poet. I don't hide it. So that's the overlap in the law and literature scholarship.
I think I'm ready to hear a poem. Would you read one for us?
Well, I'd like to actually finish by just reading some. Can we do that? And then we'll do questions. Okay. I'm going to read several poems, not that many. And I'm going to talk about them a little bit, just to put them into context, because we're shifting. I turn up just a little bit. Can you hear me okay in the back? You can't?
Want louder? Same?
Please help us. Is okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. The most recent book, so where are we? Picks up from my prior book, Into It. which was 2005, and deals a great deal with 9/11. And that's biographical. My wife and I live in Battery Park City, and we live a block really from where Ground Zero was. And the morning of 9/11, I came out here to teach. And Nancy was in our apartment, and she went out on the street. She actually was a primary, and she was voting. And then she got back up in the apartment, and our apartment faces the Hudson, so we can't see the World Trade Centers, and it's in a high-rise. There's a group of high-rises. When actually Ray Kelly, the former police commissioner, lived in the same group of apartments. But so she went back up, and then she was watching. I think she saw the plane hit, or one of the planes hit, and then she went back up and turned on the television, and everybody thought that there was an errant plane that went into the tower. And I was on the subway. I was on the R train coming out. And I got out here, and then I found out that there had been an airplane that went into the World Trade Center. I went up to my office and I called her, and she said that yes, that they say a plane went in there and a plane went in and whatever. And I said, she's a bad knee, and I said, stay in the apartment, because in '93 there was the underground bombing in the World Trade Center. And I mentioned this in Lawyerland. If the truck with explosives had been 25 feet over, the whole tower would have fallen. That's how, just that proportion. That was '93, and everybody forgets '93. That was our neighborhood. And then I went downstairs. We used to have television. We still have televisions in the atrium. We had televisions in the atrium, and I watched it in the atrium. The students were watching it. And then I watched this plane, another plane. And then I watched it fall. The first one fall. And then the second one fell. And then I went up to my office. Called Nancy, and there was no answer. And then I saw her the next day, the morning of September 12th. And I spent the night here with my colleague David Gregory and his wife Garris, who lived in Queens. And then I got into Manhattan the next morning. There was very few. I managed to get down to the apartment. And Nancy didn't know what. She knew something terrible happened. I'll read a poem about this. And then we evacuated. We stayed with Professor Gregory and his wife and his son, their son, for I think 5 weeks or 6 weeks. And I taught. And students were. As Mike will remember, we were all. Everybody in St. John's was so affected by this. Every family was so affected by it. And I'm grateful to this day, and will be grateful forever to Dean Bellicosa and Vice Dean Andy Simons for just the professionalism and the way they dealt with the St. John's, not only 9/11 but subsequently. And it's a real integral part of this law school and this university's history. And I don't have to explain this to all of you. It's part of your lives. You've all inherited this in some kind of way. So it's changed. I was working on a book of poems, and this changed what I was going to be doing. Suddenly, this is a significant thing. And so this is a poem from Into It, which came out in 2005, and then I'll read from So Where Are We? It's entitled Unyieldingly Present. And it starts on the street. And it'll become apparent where the home is, unyieldingly present. Near the curb beside the police lines, a pool of blood. The gas tanks of the cars in the garage on West Street exploding. An air tank that's out of air alarm going off pops and skidding. That woman staring into space, her dress on fire. What transpires in a second? On an intact floor, a globe of the world bursts like a balloon. A ceiling-mounted exit sign is melting. Facile equivalences are to be avoided. Hell, the horrific, into the routine. Glass and metal can be identified, not the atoms of human ash. I set down thoughts, sequences of images, of emotions, dissolved in a mass encoded in the brain. The depth or the width of the hatred measured from so high up the time it takes for those who are falling. Is it that reality disjointed cannot be discerned, or that consciousness disjointed cannot discern it? The message I am communicating, this beam of focused energy, no, I said, no. I'm not going to allow anything to happen to you. I summon up in my mind a place where my thoughts will find yours. No, nothing is going to happen. An issue of language now, isn't it? There are these vicious circles of accumulated causation. Irreal is the word. I know of no defense against those addicted to death. God, my God. I thought it was over, absolutely had to be. What am I supposed to feel? Images that, after that, loop in the head. Looming ahead in the smoke, that man at the railing can't breathe. I'm having trouble breathing, he says. You saw it? I saw it. I'm frightened. This is about which states of mind? Solid brown and gray, a muddy mass of debris and powder. There's a strip of window glazing hanging from what kind of a tree? What isn't separated? What isn't scribbled? What will not be metamorphosed, reduced, occurring, it will be said, unyieldingly fixed, unyieldingly present. There was this sense at the time that we would never forget it. Unfortunately, many of us have forgotten it. And then there were those who will never forget it. Who inherited it, and who have never forgotten it. But as an event, it's unyieldingly present. It is a significant event in world history. And it's an event that affected not only me personally, but everybody directly tied. I mean, the days after this, I was teaching Torahs. I was teaching 2 sections of Torahs. And the students were just, it was just to get through. We didn't know what was going to be happening. People had to miss because of families. So this is part of the same thing. Now, the title poem of So Where Are We picks up where Into It left off. Into It deals with war. We went to war. We're still at war as a result of what happened in 2001. And I write about that. And much of that is from a very strong Catholic side of nonviolence and an attitude of nonviolence. It comes from Martin Luther King also on the war. So where are we? So where were we? The fiery avalanche headed right at us, falling, flailing bodies in midair. The neighborhood under thick gray powder on every screen. I don't know where you are. I don't know what I'm going to do, I heard a man say. The man who had spoken was myself. What year? Which Southwest Asian war? Smoke from infants' brains on fire from the phosphorus hours after they're killed. killers reveling in the horror. The more obscene, the better. The point at which 100,000 massacre is just a detail. Acid and credit bubbles about to burst. Too much consciousness of too much at once. A tangle of tenses and parallel thoughts. A series of feelings overlapping a sudden sensation felt and known. Those chains of small facts repeated endlessly in the depths of silent time. So where are we? My eye turns like an animal's. I listen. Like it or not, a digital you is out there. Half of that city's buildings aren't there. Who was there when something was and a witness to it? The rich boy general conducts the Pakistani heroin trade on a satellite phone from his cave. On the top floor of the Federal Reserve, in an office looking onto Liberty at the South Tower's one-time space, the Secretary of the Treasury concedes they got killed in terms of perceptions. 10 blocks away, the Church of the Transfiguration. In the back, a Byzantine Madonna. There is a God who fits the drama in a very particular sense. What you said, the memory of a remembered memory, the color of a memory, violet and black, the lunar eclipse on the winter solstice, the moon, a red and black and copper hue. The streets, the harbor, the light, the sky, the blue and cloudless and tense and blue morning sky. That was the sky in the morning of September 11, 2001. It was the blue and cloudless and tense and blue morning sky. The next poem is in sections, and it's in, I think, 10 sections, in short sections. And it's entitled In Parentheses, plural. And so these are like parentheses on the other poems in the book. The first section, I identify myself as a lawyer. 1. As I said, I'm a lawyer. Technically speaking, is a head blown to pieces by a smart bomb or beheading. 2. Infinitely compressible, yet expandable, time and curved space, and the preface to Lucretius's first book of De Rerum Natura is a tribute to Venus, and the last book, a description of the plague. 3. Estimated 1 to 2,000 militia, gangs really, of 15 to 3,000 armed killers in separate overlapping networks, difficult to differentiate. And now this, quote, an anonymous State Department source, when no one could have predicted this phenomenon, the Caliphate's rise. Nothing since the triumph of the Vandals in Rome and North Africa. This sighting, this incomprehensible. 4. In the techno-capital sphere, absolute principles of profit growth, of value accumulation, the absolute freedom to recombine the production of raw materials into virtual information in spaces of time, infotime. 5. A theological political fragment, a mythographical scriptural text, and sorrow, to understand the meaning of sorrow. Saint Sorrow, the addressee of my avowal. Saint Sorrow's stern vigil necessary to keep. 6. Hyperviolence is the word, of epic proportions. A species thing, the point at which violence becomes ontology. These endless, ambitious experiments in destruction. A species grief. 7. Quite often, almost daily in fact, I have strong impressions of eternity. My ancestors are there too in the shadows. My mother, my father, grandmothers, grandfathers, whom I refuse to let perish, whispering to me to be careful. 8. What's that about? Someone I heard say that to say that Hispanics are East Asian is sort of like saying that Arabs are white. 9. Hear that? Hear that? That man's face being stepped on. skull being cracked by the baton stick, head slammed against the concrete edge, blood in his eyes, body limp, in the process now of being handcuffed. 10. I'm speaking of a law now, understand, the point at which bodies locked in cages become ontology, the point at which structures of cruelty, force, war become ontology. The analog is what I believe in, the reconstruction of the phenomenology of perception, not according to a machine, more now for the imagination to affix to than ever before. Ontology is essence. It's the philosophy of being. And two more poems. One is longer than the other, entitled That September and October. And it goes back to that September and October 2001. And when we're evacuated, mind snapped and snapped back. And the fundamental things. What you said, explosions so fierce you feared your eardrums punctured. The building shook and moved so much you thought it would crash. I was, you said, thinking of you so much. You hoped, you said, not too many were dead. Afraid that if this is war, a chemical warfare agent is in the air. Couldn't see a thing. Heavy mud-colored, swirling brown, black, gray, fine dust particles. Looked like a solid curtain of nightmare, you said, and you said you were frightened. And tower fragments the size of football fields falling in every direction. Seawater pumped from the Hudson through hoses attached to fire trucks near West Street. And at night, candles lit at windows to let the others know they're not alone. Small park across Queens Boulevard, the leafless oak against the dark green dusk air. Strips of shadow along the pavement's edge. 27th Sunday in ordinary time. And how long, my God, have I cried out the violence to you, but you do not intervene? How long have I cried out for help, my God, but you do not listen? From the book of the prophet Habakkuk. Today, sunny and windy, blustery, tonight and cold. Marines and Army may scour caves, U.S. General says, headline in the Times. No longer in the government, but on the inside with those in the government, the Taliban in Afghanistan won't last another month, he says. Sudan or maybe next to Bekaa Valley, but Iraq. There's no evidence Iraq was involved, but we feel it is. We feel it, he says. And anyway, he smiles, conditions are now ideal to take it. Acid mist, volatile organic compounds, dangerous levels of asbestos. Rising and spiraling white steam. Blowtorch produced green vapor, pit fumes, white stinking, transformed in pink light until clouds of smoke obscure. A common fate, pain can't forget, incessantly pulled apart in this memory's light. And the final poem is a short poem toward the end of the book, and a favorite of mine. And for the record, it was a legal title, right? Actually, in any of the reviews, nobody's noticed that. I've never known anybody else to title a poem For the Record. Thought somebody might notice it. And for the record, revelations reoccurring. He who was babbling away in James Madison Plaza, what goes around, what comes around. Light made holy by the fury of the tears with which it mingles. Simple enough when looked at directly. A child, shy and fearful, who won't speak. And for the record, the mind, like the night, has 1,000 eyes. Sparrows in the bushes, a small cat rolls in the snow, sleep pounding the windows. In the space of a memory, the facade of a church, an angel on each side of a fiery wheel.
Professor. So, cognizant of time, I want to give you guys a chance to ask a few questions if anyone has one. I don't think we have a mic, but we just have to speak up, okay? Hey? Anthony.
Thank you, Professor Gibson.
as I do in class. Speak up.
Going back to Nick had asked about the process when you create poems. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more of when you're actually writing a poem. What is the process that goes? Do you write it all in one sitting, or is it a constant editing phase? When is a poem essentially finished in your mind?
Well, I've been doing it a long time, so it's changed. And, so I've done it different kinds of ways, but I'm a note taker, and so I work very much from notes. And I feel at a certain point I've got to get the notes down into the poems. And the notes also include what I want to do with the next book. Once I wrote the first book, I was thinking of the second and consecutively, and so I'm now thinking of the next book. And taking notes, and I have notes from that I haven't used in the other ones. And then I compose. And the act of composition is learned. That's the work. And that's learned over a period of time. Do I revise? Yes, of course. I mean, I revise. I don't think there's I've never written a poem that it came out exactly the way I wanted it. There are poets who don't revise, but I revise a lot. And I move things around, and I'm very aware of writing not only the individual poems, but books. And I want the book of poems to certainly be the equivalent of a novel. And I think a book of poems can do more than a novel can do, because it can compress language and emotion and feeling. And the plot is really in poems is the plot of emotion and the plot of feeling. Which is why people go to poetry. It's why I go to poetry. So, I don't know if that answers your
No,
question.
that definitely helps. Thank you.
Yes.
Going from what you just said about the emotion that you feel when you write poetry, do you feel like sometimes when there's a big event like 9/11 that the poetry is a sort of therapy for you?
No, poetry's never been therapy for me. This is something I need to do. I need to make poems. So I'm closer to it's a craft. In the deepest sense, but it's like a compulsion. Stephen said at one point, why would anybody else do? Why would you do it? And if it wasn't a compulsion over a lifetime, with the seriousness and the constant doing it. So no, it never served as therapy for me. And the emotion of writing a poem, I'm not sure that different from the emotion I want to put into a poem. And when I'm writing a poem, I have a very kind of compositional side. It's like, and I use composition very carefully because most people think of composition with musicians. But poets deal with music, they deal with sound, and compressed sound, as musicians deal with compressed sound. And musicians don't have language, but they have the language of sound, and when you're the act of creating is emotional, but the emotion and the actual object of art is a different type of thing. And let me know if you can't hear me. Yes.
Do you have any poems that you feel are better read aloud than read on the page? And related to that, do you have anything on slam poetry?
I read them out loud when I'm writing them, or after I write them. So I want them to be heard. And so I think some, depending on the audience and whatever, some poems can't read them all, and so some read easier than others. But I'm very concerned with the way it sounds. It's compressed and it can be very dense to a listener, but sometimes conversation is very dense. So it's this compressed conversation at some level. Slam poetry is I've never done it. I know people who have done it, and it's not on the page. And I write poetry for the page to also be heard. And so whether it's poetry or not, I don't doubt that it is. And when I've heard it. But the question of what's poetry and not poetry is a kind of, it really doesn't take you anywhere. you make the poem the way you need to make the poem. And then you basically develop a tradition from which you work out. And so slam poets are developing a tradition out of slam poetry, which moves into rap and all sorts of musical side and performance side, and moves closer to performed vocal language, where you can do that on the page. I mean, I could have gotten up and walked around and read this, but it's not the primary part of it, isn't the performance side. The performing side of it is in the language, actually. Yes?
You mentioned that in class, for example, you're able to kind of turn off the poetry side so that you can use your lawyer's side. You've also mentioned that in a number of different ways that both of those two sides are inextricably linked. Do you experience them as being two different sides of you? And if so, do you prefer one?
No, I think Stevens is right. They're part of the same person. I don't prefer one over the other. It's just a different language. I mean, I have all sorts of different languages other than poetry. And I have all sorts of different languages other than law, as all of us do. So it's just, this is what I do. And so I focus on it, and it's, I'm aware of language games. And I'm aware of the way language operates in law, which is, I think, the same, the lawyers I've always respected the most, the best lawyers, are very conscious of the way the language operates in law. And they're not, they're not poets. They don't write poetry, but they certainly are imaginative, and critically so. We know how to read language and use language. So it's language, when you're using it critically, involves the imagination. And so it's just, this happens, I happen to have this overlap, which is nothing special. I don't consider anything special. It's just I happen to have this. Yes?
So, like any other art, when you're working on the creative process, there comes a time when you have to review it. How do you get to the point, or how do you decide to get to the point where this isn't just another poem for the file, there's something you want to present to everybody else?
Well, that's a long process, and it's changed over the years when I started doing it. I started doing it in a context when I was an undergraduate with others that were doing it and wanted to do this, or felt they wanted to do this for the rest of their lives. And so, and then that was particular to that time and place. And then after that, one of the things I learned is the whole question of trying to get it out there, given the time where I was doing this and when I was doing it. So it's idiosyncratic at that level. And it's changed. It's changed over time, and the cyberspace has changed it. And also, once I had a publisher, and I've been blessed with really great publishers and editors who really, it's basically, I'm writing, the except telling me to write to the art. In other words, right to the highest level I can in the art, and then I show it to them. I show it to a couple of close writer friends. And so it's a process, and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I just do it. And then you're constantly editing it. I mean, once you know you've got a publisher and you know your editor is a great editor, that really alleviates a lot of the problem that you bring up. Yes?
I heard a rather harsh critique about poetry movies, in that when the rules for movies were relaxed about censorship for profanity and sex, and for poetry, the structure that it didn't require the same level of creativity that it did before when the rules were in existence. And I was wondering your opinion on that, and whether you think that applies to law, where seemingly every writing is within rules.
Yeah, there's rules, there's form. And the form is sometimes open form. Novels are open form. Poetry is an open form. I mean, you're in any form. Law's formal sides are stricter. In other words, if you're writing something, you're within a kind of formal range. you can choose to do that as a writer. I'm not sure I understood your argument on the pornography.
Well, as I understood in movies, I don't know, I guess in like 50s, 60s, they weren't allowed to curse and they weren't allowed to show scenes of sex and involve sex. So
Well,
the dialogue.
That's not altogether true. There were movies that did do that in the 50s and 60s.
He's not talking about those movies.
And poetry is a Venice novel? Is that what you're asking? In terms of what you can express?
From what I understand, initially poetry was required like very strict structure.
Yeah, well, that's part of the tradition of form in poetry, and that's a whole unlimited subject in terms of the poetry is, you know, the Psalms in the Old Testament are poets who wrote those. And they're open form. And so form is always there, and any kind of literary writing form is always there. So poets think about form, and anybody doing it thinks about form. That's actually what you think about most. And that's the inside side of it. And it's a really great gift to be able to want to think like that, because then when I read writers, I can figure out what they're doing formally, which is, it gives me an enormous amount of pleasure to be able to read them that way.
Maybe one more question?
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned a lot about your Jesuit education and also your upbringing, and I found strong religious undertones in your poems. I was just wondering how faith plays a role in the creative process for you.
Well, it's in the creative process, since it's fundamental in my life, and so if it's fundamental in my life, it's going to be fundamental in my imagination. And so when I'm making imaginative choices, depending on what I'm making, it comes into play. It's come into play from the beginning, and that's been recognized. That's one of my where religious Catholic side of my imagination, etc. And I've always been aware of that. I've been aware of it from the beginning. And then there's traditions of this. I mean, it's not, I didn't come up with another first one to do this. But I think a lot of the structure, when my parents didn't go to college, and the missiles we had when we were children, we used to go to mass every day. We'd read the language of the mass was in Latin and English before Vatican II. But then they had the days of the saints and everything. I remember reading this from the time I was 5 or 6, and reading this language. It was one of my first languages. And so it's also, if you take the language of Catholicism, it virtually goes back into world thought a long time. And it's in virtually one of the, just Dante is an example. And so it embodies all sorts of truths. And it's the way in which a poet can choose to use. Poets write with a quote-unquote religious sensibility. They always have. Some people say poets are the ones that invented God. So they have, a friend of mine, a poet, Paul Muldoon, was asked, does he believe in God? And he said, I've got to, we invented him, right? The poets invented him, right? So that's the level you get to. You know, I don't know if that answers your question.
So I battled and lost to have some books for purchase here tonight. Small victory is that if you look on the placards that we have, you can see where to purchase some of these books. And I lost Professor Joseph because he wanted us to focus on the poetry and on the academic side of this event. Professor, this was a blessing. Thank you again for doing this lesson.